All right, so I just want to say something kind of real quick about Israel. An observation I've made, or something I've been thinking for years, that it seems that I've never heard anyone really do a comparison, if you will. So I want to start by talking about Liberia. This ain't going to be long. If you ever look at like a map of Africa, the continent of Africa, when during the height of colonization, you'll see there's two regions or countries that were never really colonized. There's Ethiopia and this small country about the size of Tennessee called Liberia in West Africa. And if you look a little closer at Liberia, you see some strange things about it if you know nothing about the country. One, its flag looks oddly like the American flag, the United States flag. And two, the capital of this country is Monrovia, as in James Monroe, right? So why is it that these countries were never colonized? Well, Ethiopia, they resisted colonization by the Italians. The Italians occupied the region of what is now called Eritrea, and they occupied portions of Ethiopia, but they were never able to completely conquer it. Good on Ethiopia. Why was Liberia, this tiny country, never colonized? Well, it was never colonized because it was already a colony of the United States, essentially. So Liberia was actually settled by former slaves from the United States and the Caribbean. They showed up around 1828, I think, and started their country. It wasn't recognized by the U.S. until 1862 because there's no way the U.S. was going to acknowledge the existence of a country founded by former slaves. I mean, look at the treatment of Haiti for essentially centuries. But in 1862, the consideration was, well, if we win this war being the Civil War, what do we do with all these blacks? Because despite what your history books try to tell you, Abraham Lincoln did not think blacks were equal with whites. He really didn't care too much about freeing slaves initially. He just wanted to preserve the Union and realize that that was a good thing to rally people behind. So when you look at the whole formation of Liberia and the present territory, it actually didn't start that way. It kind of expanded. These blacks, these former enslaved people, which I mean, by the way, I'm an American black, so I come from formerly enslaved people. They showed up and they pushed the indigenous people into the interior, further into the interior of the country. In fact, I don't think it was until maybe the 1980s a person who didn't have who wasn't what they would call American Liberian or Amero Liberian or American Liberian wasn't the leader of the country. I don't think the indigenous population had birthright citizenship until about 1902. So if you're an indigenous Liberian, you're basically you're being exploited by this small minority, because I think at its most, I think the American Liberians, these are the groups of people, once again, they came from mostly the Caribbean and United States, and in roughly equal proportions. They only made up about 5% of the population. Currently, they make up about 150,000 people out of a 5.5 million population. So just think about that. The fact that even a century and a half after its formation, you have these clear groups of clear ethnic groups. You have this various indigenous ethnic groups and the American Liberian population who have their own identity. They speak an English Creole. It sounds similar to like, it's kind of sounds similar to like Gullah or Caribbean English, but they speak English, even though it's kind of, like I said, I wouldn't call it a Creole. It's not really a Creole, but it's I guess you could say it's kind of a dialect of English and a manner of speaking. So they went there and they took over the country, and even though they had this small population, they managed to really exploit the people there, the indigenous people. And they were upfront with it. They were colonizers. Like the group that started was the American Colonization Society. They were upfront with it. We're colonizers. They showed up. They brought back, Western European Christian traditions. They built their homes to look like antebellum Southern homes. They were more American, specifically Southern American and Caribbean American, than they were African. Right. The only thing that made them African was genetics, but not culture. So the thing I don't get is why the comparisons between Liberia and Israel aren't made, because you have two groups of people who were unwanted in the country that they were in, faced generations of violence and discrimination. Now this is 1828, but even by 1828, you're talking about centuries of, if you were one of, like in the United States, if you were, I think 90% of the black population, a little bit, roughly 92% of the black population in the U.S. was enslaved. Roughly 8 to 10% were free blacks, but even those free blacks were facing discrimination, didn't have the full rights of American citizens, were unwanted. So kind of, a landless people, especially after the Civil War. What do you do with them? The difference is we just stayed here. There really wasn't there have been various movements to set up colonies or to quote unquote return to Africa, Pan-Africanism, but never with the same fervor as Israel. So why is it that we don't make the comparison to those groups or to those two countries? And I think it's because we would have to just recognize the simple fact that Israel is a colony. When all the other Europeans had stopped colonizing, this one group of people who were Europeans, or largely Europeans, there are Jews there are black Jews, and there are Middle Eastern Jews. But the great majority of the Jewish population in Israel is Ashkenazi Sephardic European Jew. So they show up and they colonize this country, and the indigenous people there get exploited. One of the problems that's actually happened in Israel now is that they have this cheap labor that comes from the Palestinians that they're no longer able to use. The Israeli economy at this point is basically really hurting. But yeah, it's a colony. And the thing that made me really, I've been thinking about this for years, but the thing that I guess brought it fresh in my mind is I'm watching this discussion between these, I'm not going to say their names, but these individuals who are both leftists, but one is a Zionist and the other one isn't. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the one who wasn't a Zionist, the one who was basically calling Israel a colonial state, was black. Because the argument was Israel has ties there because of history. It was like 2,000 years ago they were expelled from the Middle East. Okay, and a couple of hundred years ago, my ancestors were sold into slavery and shipped against their will to the New World. And there's a chance that the indigenous people of Liberia, their ancestors were part of that capturing and selling. But guess what? If I show up in Liberia and join that 5% of the population, I am leading to that legacy of colonization at this point. I do think there is a bit of a difference. We can say one that's a much smaller population. And I'm not saying that American Liberians, their identity is African at this point. The thing about Israel, though, is that at this point it's an ongoing colonial project, meaning that you have, Jewish people in Brooklyn who are planning to move to Israel or have moved to Israel. So it's basically just white people moving to Israel and colonizing it because of because they're Europeans. Of course they can be everywhere. And one observation that people make is they say, well, if you see some Palestinians, you really can't tell the difference whether they're European. That's absolutely true. But whiteness is not really totally tied to skin color. Whiteness is a social construct. Like in Liberia, in the 1820s and up until I think it was, like I said, 1902. I think it says 1902 or 1904, when the indigenous people didn't have birthright citizenship in that territory within Liberia. That 5% of the population who were American Liberians, they had proxy whiteness there, and they tried to emulate whiteness. They dressed white. When I say white, they dressed Western. They specifically dressed like the plantation owners that had owned them and exploited them, and they built antebellum homes there. So that may make some people feel some sort of way, but there's no other way to call it. Liberia, it was a colonized by former African slaves who, although they had been exploited and abused, they went to Africa and put that exploitation abuse onto the indigenous population. And for Jews, even though for thousands of years, and we talk about the Holocaust all the time, the thousands of years that led to the Holocaust, violence in Russia, pogroms, violence in the I can pick a country in Europe, and it's basically Jewish people. I don't know why I said it like that, but Jewish people being constantly living in fear of violence long before the Holocaust, subject to random violence. And what do they do in return? They go to Israel, or they go to Palestine, and now they visit that violence onto the Palestinians. And there is an irony to that, because quite frankly, leading up into the Holocaust, if there was any place in the world you could live being a Jewish person and probably be the safest, it was probably the Middle East. And that's the other thing they say, is that, the Arab population have always hated the Jews. Their population hasn't always hated the Jews. Their population referred to Jews as people of the book. Christians have always hated the Jews, with the exception of Jesus and Moses.